A French company called it a 3-month posting. St. Paul Island called it a sentence. In 1930, 7 workers were left to guard a lobster factory on a storm-rimmed speck of rock in the southern Indian Ocean. No trees, no fresh water, and a radio none of them could operate. One woman was 8 months pregnant. The supply ship sailed away, and the horizon stayed empty. And the real danger wasn't the sea. It was being forgotten on purpose. From a distance, St. Paul appears almost designed to turn human plans into jokes. The sea around it is rarely calm. Swell moves in uninterrupted from thousands of kilometers of open ocean and breaks against the cliffs with the blunt insistence of a metronome. There is no freshwater stream to follow inland. No forest to cut for shelter, no orchard or garden to reassure you that life here is meant to be lived. The island has a crater lake, a flooded volcanic caldera roughly 800 meters wide, and patches of scrub and grass that cling where they can, but nothing you could build a diet or a future around. The place feels less like land than like a temporary misunderstanding between lava and water. In the late 1920s, a French company with a name that sounded like a promise, Langouste Francaise. The French Lobster set its sights on the island's surrounding waters. The seas off St. Paul crawled with Yassus palensis, a spiny lobster endemic to the subantarctic Indian Ocean and one of the most commercially prized crustaceans in the French seafood export market. The company was run by 2 brothers, Ari and René Bossier, businessmen and ship owners operating in the far-flung subantarctic world of the Kerguelen Islands. They recruited fishermen from Brittany and the coasts of southwest England, men who knew nets and weather and the hard pragmatism of earning your meals from salt water. For one season, the scheme looked like genius. Reports circulated that the men were hauling in tens of thousands of lobsters a day. The factory's machinery clanged and steamed. Tin and salt and smoke turned living animals into marketable product. The brothers, far away, had numbers to admire. If there is a religion among certain kinds of entrepreneurs, it is the belief that remote places exist mainly as raw material. The next year they returned with more people and grander intentions. Workers came not only from France but from Madagascar, a French colony since 1896, where wages were low and alternatives were few. 100 men labored in a place that could not support a single family. The season went well until a fire swept through storage and destroyed much of the food supply, an event that should have been taken as a warning from the island itself. Fire on St. Paul is not like fire elsewhere. It doesn't burn your comforts, it burns your margins. On an island with no gardens and no markets, losing stores isn't an inconvenience. It's the beginning of a countdown. When the season ended in March 1930, the company loaded the workers and the year's product onto a ship and prepared to leave. But the factory remained. The machines were valuable. The buildings, crude as they were, represented investment. The lobsters would return with the next season. Someone, the administrator said, should stay behind through the winter to guard the works, maintain the equipment, and keep the island from reclaiming what humans had bolted to it. Winter on St. Paul was not a concept, it was a sentence. Still, 7 people volunteered. 6 men and 1 woman, Louise, nearly 8 months pregnant. What drove them to agree is hard to reconstruct from the scattered records. Perhaps loyalty, perhaps naivety, perhaps the belief that hardship is tolerable when it has an endpoint. The company promised a resupply ship in 3 months. It left them a handful of canned food, 4 pigs, 8 goats, and the vague assurance that the world had not forgotten them. There was a radio, transmitter to a thin thread to civilization, but none of the 7 knew how to use it. Like so many lifelines, it existed more convincingly on paper than it did in practice. The ship pulled away. The sound of its engines faded into the wind. The 7 stood on the shore and watched it go, surrounded by the ruins of ambition. A factory, a few shelters, the ocean. In the beginning, there was still the comfort of countdown. 3 months is short enough to be imagined as a bad season, an inconvenience. They tightened their routines, patched their shelters, rationed supplies. The pigs and goats wandered the spare ground. The men hunted and fished when the sea allowed it. They learned the island's moods, the way weather can change in minutes, the way the wind seems to come from everywhere at once, the way waves can hurl themselves onto the narrow strip of land where you are, trying to sleep and make the whole world feel like it is shaking you awake. Louise went into labor on March 26th. There is something particularly stark about childbirth in a place like St. Paul, where the landscape offers no softness and the horizon offers no help. Louise delivered a baby, Paul, the records say, among men who were fishermen, not midwives, with no doctor, no medicine beyond what the sea provides and what luck permits. The child lived only a few weeks. Malnutrition, exposure, infection, the likely causes pile up the way waves do. Each one alone perhaps survivable, together inescapable. The castaways buried the infant in ground that would not hold a garden, let alone a grave. There were no flowers to gather, no wood for a marker that would last. The wind on St. Paul has a talent for making grief look unfinished. By June, the promised 3 months had passed. By July, the promise had become an insult. The supplies dwindled. The men slaughtered animals and ate what they could, stretching meals with penguins and their eggs, with whatever fish could be taken from the violent water, with rats that had followed human presence the way they always do. Canned meat, once a convenience, became their primary diet. It kept them alive while quietly removing what their bodies needed to stay alive. On July 4th, one of the men, Emmanuel, grew ill. At first, illness looks like fatigue. In hard places, everyone is tired, everyone is hungry, everyone aches. But Emmanuel's legs began to swell and yellow. He lost his appetite. He could not urinate. The others watched, helpless, the way people watch a storm approach when there is nowhere to run. They opened the medical book and read. The book offered a diagnosis that sounded antique. A disease of old voyagers and wooden ships, scurvy, between 1500 and 1800. Scurvy is estimated to have killed more than 2 million sailors, more deaths than all naval combat in that same period. The human body cannot synthesize vitamin C on its own and exhausts its reserves in as little as 4 to 6 weeks without fresh food. On St. Paul, that biological fact had no exit. Scurvy is not dramatic in the way plague is dramatic. It does not sweep through a camp in a night. It is slow and methodical, a failure of connective tissue that makes the body come undone at its seams. It begins with weakness and irritability, then moves to bleeding gums, wounds that do not heal, swelling, pain. Sailors once called it the scurvy, as if it were a beast that stalked the hold. In truth, it is simpler and crueler, a deficiency, the absence of something small that the body cannot improvise. St. Paul offered no fruit, no vegetables, no citrus miracle hidden in a grove. The canned food and salted meat that seemed adequate on a manifest were chemically barren. Emmanuel's condition worsened, 2 weeks after the first signs, he died. The island took him the way it takes everything, without ceremony. Shortly after, Francois showed the same symptoms by then. The survivors understood what was happening, which only made their helplessness sharper. Knowledge is not power when there is nothing to do with it. Francois died at the end of August, 6 months after they had been left. In the weeks that followed, Victor, Louise's husband, succumbed as well. The castaways had begun as 7. Now there were 4. They lived in a shrinking circle of effort. Each day required decisions that would have been unimaginable at home. Whether to eat a penguin today or save the ammunition for later. Whether to risk the surf for fish. Whether to slaughter another goat and accept the future hunger that decision implied. Hunger changes the mind. It makes time viscous. On St. Paul, ethics were not debated. They were negotiated in whispers and glances and the knowing emptiness under the ribs. October came with a particular cruelty. One of the remaining men, Pierre, went out to see 2 fish. The weather was bad, but on St. Paul, bad weather is ordinary, and the need for food is constant. He did not return. There was no search party, only 3 other bodies barely functioning, and an ocean that does not give back what it takes. Pierre's disappearance left them with 3, Louise, Julienne, and Leo in France. Far away, the world was being rearranged by the Great Depression. Between 1930 and 1932, French industrial output fell by nearly 25% and registered unemployment tripled. In Madagascar, where many of the workers had been recruited, the collapse of export prices made already desperate conditions worse. Companies that had once behaved as if the future were guaranteed began to behave as if only next week mattered. Somewhere in this churn of worry, St. Paul's Winter Guards became a line item, an obligation to be honored if convenient, postponed if not. Months passed. No ship appeared on the horizon. On December 6, 1930, 10 months after the company's ship had sailed away, the next season's vessel finally arrived at St. Paul with new workers and new plans. The men on deck expected to find a functioning guard crew, perhaps thin and grumpy, but alive. What they found were 3 survivors in the state that starvation reduces people to: skin drawn tight over bone, eyes too large for their faces, voices gone. They could not speak. They pointed instead toward the makeshift graves and the places where the island had swallowed their companions. The rescuers described them as living skeletons, a phrase that feels melodramatic until you picture what months of deficiency does to a human being. The body consuming itself, the muscles thinning, the fat disappearing, the mind narrowing to the next mouthful. Rescue should have been an ending. It wasn't. Louis boarded the departing ship and left the island behind. But Louise and Leo stayed. Whether they stayed because the company pressured them, because they saw no alternative, because depression near France looked as bleak as St. Paul, or because trauma can make the familiar, even the horrible, feel safer than return. No record can fully explain. What is clear is that the logic of exploitation did not stop when the rescue ship arrived. The lobster season mattered. The machinery mattered. The ledger mattered. Human beings apparently mattered less. The following summer, 1931 into 1932, the factory swelled again with workers, many from Madagascar. Their diet was dominated by what could be trapped and scavenged, rats foremost among them. The island, which had already demonstrated its indifference, now became a laboratory for another deficiency disease, beriberi. caused by a lack of vitamin B1. Thiamine presents in two deadly forms: wet berry, which overwhelms the cardiovascular system, and dry berry, which destroys the peripheral nerves. Both are entirely preventable with a diet containing whole grains, legumes, or fresh meat, none of which existed in adequate supply on St. Paul, like scurvy. It is a disease of absence, a punishment for diets shaped not by nourishment but by desperation. Over that season, more than 40 men died. The numbers written in reports and later in newspapers have a way of numbing the imagination until you force yourself to translate them into faces. 40 separate bodies failing. 40 separate moments when someone realized he was going to die far from home, in a place that offered no comfort beyond the company of other doomed men. If the first winter on St. Paul was a tragedy, the next was a scandal. Eventually, even the Bossier brothers' enterprise could not survive its own callousness and mismanagement. Operations ceased. The equipment rusted. The camp was abandoned to weather and birds and the slow erasure of salt. For a time, the story remained largely unheard. Catastrophes in remote places are easy to ignore, especially when they happen to workers whose names do not appear in polite society. The dead of St. Paul had no lobbyists. It was only later, years after the worst of it, that the case gathered enough attention to demand a courtroom. In 1935, newspapers began to publish accounts of les oubliés de St. Paul, the forgotten ones of St. Paul. A court case unfolded in the familiar language of responsibility and compensation. In April 1937, nearly 6 years after the castaways were left, a verdict was finally issued. The Langusti Francaise Company was convicted, and Louise was promised compensation. On paper, justice had been done. Promises on St. Paul have a history. The company went bankrupt. The compensation was never paid. Louise and the other survivors received what the island had always offered: survival, and then abandonment in a different form. Today, St. Paul Island is uninhabited. It falls under the French Southern and Antarctic lands, a territory covering 439,781 square kilometers of subantarctic ocean, with a permanent human population of 0 outside of seasonal scientific stations. In 2019, the French Southern and Antarctic lands, including St. Paul, were inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Recognized for their extraordinary biodiversity and ecological significance, the factory ruins still scar the northern shore. Stone outlines and collapsed walls that look from above like the bones of a small animal. A plaque stands in remembrance, both on the island and in France. A thin acknowledgement that those lives existed, but the plaque does not convey what the wind conveys, or what the sea conveys, or what it means to be reduced to a handful of people staring at an empty horizon day after day, keeping faith with a ship that is not coming. In the end, St. Paul isn't only a survival story, though it has the familiar ingredients: isolation, hunger, cold, and the cruel beauty of a place that doesn't care if you live or die. It's a story about betrayal that looks ordinary until you count the bodies. 7 workers trusted a timetable and a company seal. They believed the modern world keeps its promises that if rescue is due in 3 months, a ship will come in 3 months. On St. Paul, they learned the older truth. Distance makes it easy to forget your obligations, and the people who pay are rarely the ones who decide. The ocean is dangerous, but the deadliest force here wasn't the surf or the storms. It was indifference disguised as enterprise. An office decision that resupply could wait, that rations could stretch, that accountability could be postponed. The island didn't invent scurvy or teach them to misuse the radio. Those were human failures made far away in comfort, until their consequences became unavoidable, and still the details remain. Emmanuel's legs swelling yellow. Francois searching a medical book for a cure that wasn't there. Victor fading. Pierre vanishing into white water. Louise pointing at graves when words failed. They weren't symbols. They were workers, left raw by the rock and the wind. St. Paul is just one dot on the map, but the world is full of places like it, where suffering happens out of sight. Remembering it is the only small defiance.